Hello to everyone and welcome. My name is Elena Narinskaya and I am a founding director of Women's Ministries Initiative, which is an educational forum facilitating discussions on various timely, important and often difficult subjects. Today we're introducing a series of educational webinars, to be precise 6 of them. It is a joint initiative between the Center of Applied Theology and Women's Ministries Initiative, and I am grateful for the CAT for their generous welcome. The purpose of these webinars is to understand deeper one's own religious tradition, its depth and complexity, as well as to address a number of timely topics. The way we will go about it is by facilitating various themed discussions and by inviting interesting, experienced and learned guests. We begin today with the theme of icons as a way of introducing the series into the rich legacy of Orthodox Christian tradition. This topic cannot possibly be exhausted by means of 1-hour Zoom session. But what we can do is to make an attempt to channel our today's discussion into the realm of now. Now is something that we want to pay particular attention to in all our webinars in this series, especially that now that we're living in is such an unprecedented time, which makes our discussion today relevant, needed and challenging. Contemplating about now and iconography in preparation for this webinar, a few rather powerful comparisons and symbolisms popped into my mind. The first one is COVID and plagues. Comparison of COVID with ancient plagues, starting with Old Testament plagues of Egypt, the stories of Moses and the Pharaoh, and the relationships and the complexity that was developed between them. More recently, the COVID is compared to the time of war, our times that we're living and the complexities of the times. And this is something else that I wanted to address. We do not have as such the theology of a COVID or iconology of COVID. And this is something that we might be able to contemplate and ponder in this roundtable discussion. As we have iconographers practicing and well established, as well as theologians and art historians present in this panel. So if we are to present a symbolism, an iconographic image of COVID as a symbol, do we approach it as a blessing or as a curse? Do we look at God as giving us a lesson or a punishment or a curse? And in a way, in developing the iconology or iconography of this contemporary situation could be something to ponder if we wish to. Listening to my introduction of this webinar, one could be surprised as to the relation of what I have just said to the topic of icons, iconography, iconology. I believe that the relation is there and it is rather strong. If one is to contemplate the role of the icons in the times of war or in the times of severe distress, this is when one finds this connection. The first connection is to the theme of this webinar. And the second one, perhaps the most important one, is the connection of the theme of this webinar with what is going on in our lives at this particular moment. It is a learning experience for everyone, these webinars and this webinar series. and it is a learning experience for us, living in such an unprecedented times. So I ask you all to be open and understanding with us, and with me as a facilitator, as I will be trying a lot of new things, possibly some of life improvisations, so that we can find out what works best in the new age of Zoom. In the next part of the webinar, I will give each participant an opportunity to introduce themselves for about 2 minutes. This is instead of me introducing each of our guest panelists one by one. Also, I'm adding an improvised questions to all our guests. In your 2 minutes introduction, could you please include, if possible, your thoughts on what I just mentioned previously? The symbolism, COVID and plagues and the times of war and the intensity there, contemporary relevance of our topic today, or anything else that you felt inclined to comment on as I was introducing the series. Your introductions will have to be brief within a couple of minutes if possible. After your introductions, I will be asking more pointing questions, such as icons and their relevance in now, challenges of addressing now in iconography, and also ways of overcoming these challenges. The idea behind inviting guests for these webinars was to offer different points of view on the subject from the different areas of expertise, be it philosophy, art history, iconography, and theology. Therefore, we ended up with a rather significant number of people on the panel. So it is with great pleasure and with great anticipation that I am giving this Zoom space to our guests for a brief introduction. And I would like Father Andreas to start, please.
Well, thank you very much for putting this together, Elena. And I guess you're introducing people alphabetically. So I have the honor of the double A here. This is a wonderful thing and very interesting with many extensions and always fresh. So very briefly, because there are so many people, I'm teaching at the University of Winchester, and researching on icons has been something that I have done for a very long time. Although I cannot myself draw a straight line if my life depends on it. So as they say, those who can't do, teach. Now, you sent us a list of questions to reflect on. And the first one is, what is an icon? Now, of course, we could give many answers to this one. Very briefly, we could explore this, this question from a philosophical, theological point of view. What is an image, an icon, what it has meant for the patristic tradition, what has it meant for Neoplatonist philosophers, and so on and so on. But we know that the main thrust of this question among us today has to do with images in religious use. So although we could have long and interesting conversations about the theological and the philosophical content of icons in antiquity and in the Middle Ages, especially in the way that we're trying to see the modern context of questions like that. Of course, this question has to do with specific objects of art or veneration that are used primarily, although not exclusively, in the Orthodox Church. If we try to start with something like a definition. So at this level, the question of what is an icon is something that we may address in approximately this way: a visual artistic expression of what is otherwise the invisible part of the Christian tradition, either in the form of dead people who are believed to be sanctified, or in the form of events from the life of Jesus Christ and the saints, as viewed, and that's very important, from the point from the perspective of the church. Of course, we know that we could expand on this much more. We could talk about the inverted perspective. We could talk about the point of view of the point of view of God that is imparted to us in icons. But as a basis of what are we talking about, we can start something like this. Now, the next question you have asked us to reflect on, which extends this, is what is the purpose and the use of an icon? And here we can find several levels. First, traditionally at least, the icon is something that transmitted knowledge and information by portraying biblical or historical events through the lens of the experience and the memory of the church. And it's for this reason that it was often known as the gospel of the illiterate. But the latter part is important because this information was always considered through a theological perspective, not just an attempt to portray literally what is on the text. So it's a memory of the text of the event rather than the precise chronology, chronicle information. This part also, the theological perspective, consisted a theological elaboration very often and development of the significance of the depicted person or event. So icons take a certain liberty with respect to what they start with. They give us more information, or already the information, the biblical information, and already a commentary attached on it. So for this reason, as people who study icons, we can see very often in them the same values as sermons have, or other theological sources from a time in the past, or even from our time. So rather than simply transmitting a piece of information, such as Jesus Christ was crucified, they also provide the thought or attitude around this piece of information. Second, in either a private environment, private home, or in a church environment, icons suggest a presence, or to connect it with the previous bit, the memory of the depicted person or event as a presence in the here and now, instead of an absence that was lost in time and became a thing of the past. There is something very much present in the now about icons. This is, of course, based on and reinforces the belief of the continuity between the here, the historical time, and the there, the eschatological time, or the time of God. And this, I think, allows us to give a third level of answer, precisely because of this property of icons. Icons, in the end, can be considered as having a liturgical function. Without getting into it much longer here, icons may be considered, I believe, within the wider context of liturgical or sacramental theology, as parts of a dramatic language that helps make present the body of Jesus Christ in the here and now, because we address them, because we are addressed by them, because they make part of the prayer and worshiping space, because they interpret the world through the lens of the church and God. Okay, there's much we know about this. Now, you asked us to reflect on two other questions, and I think I have sort of one answer for both of them. So far, this could have been a web seminar about icons in the past, but what is very interesting is where do we go from here, and can we identify problems or issues or ways forward with modern icons or icons from recent ages. So here there is a problem with representing saints from the distant past, and a somewhat different problem in representing saints from the very recent past. And for this reason, we can discuss those two issues making the same point. We can represent saints from the distant past by trying to provide a historically correct depiction in relation to their clothes, objects from the time, and so forth. This solution, however, although it may be historically correct or trying to be historically correct, since our visual reference has changed dramatically since antiquity or the Middle Ages, So this solution runs the danger of making these themes not relatable. So the communication is somehow breaking down. And therefore icons in this case may be transformed into parts of a discourse that has an indirect only correspondence with the conceptual themes or the spiritual values they represent. The other possible solution that has not really been explored, not very much in the East, in the Orthodox world, is what we see some Renaissance iconographer tried. And that was to use clothes and objects of our own time rather than the historically accurate ones. So what's the benefit in this one? By portraying the soldiers that crucified Jesus with the clothes of the soldiers that they had at the time, that's, as we said, historically correct, but very few people make the connection. What they see is a soldier from another age. It doesn't convey the sense of the soldier in the here and now. So in some ways, that somewhat unusual exploration or possibility is perhaps spiritually honest, but it did not find much support in the Orthodox world. Of course, there are a few examples. The most interesting examples I have are from perhaps the most famous painter in the Greek tradition, who started as iconographer, and that's Yanis Tsarouchis. But it has not really entered the world of traditional iconography. A third possibility, which perhaps is more meaningful today, would be to try to express a historically transcendent level of reality, a reality beyond things. So portray people and places as if they're already transfigured, as if they're already in the beyond time. We find this direction in some modern Orthodox iconographers, and it is in some of the iconography of the last few years that I can find some original, creative, and spiritually sound explorations. But for now, these are only explorations, and precisely that's why we're here. I think that's all I had to say for now. I didn't want to say too much, so this is it.
Thank you very much. Although it was supposed to be a very brief introduction at this point, I did not want to interfere with the contribution of Father Andreas. And if this is the way we are to continue, we will allow a little bit more time for each of the following participants, but please try to keep it briefer at this moment in time. And I'm giving the floor to Aidan at this point.
Thank you very much, Elena, for asking me to this webinar. My name's Aidan Hart. I've been an icon painter for about 40 years and a carver of icons. I agree with everything that Father just said, so I won't repeat any of that. One element of the icon that is really important, and this is more to do with how the subject is depicted rather than what. The icon ultimately is a means of communion with the saints whom we depict. But it's the how we depict the saints. And this is all to do with how we see not just the saints, but the whole world. So for me, what's so interesting is I want people to help see the world and people, not just as a bush, but a bush burning with the fire of God's presence within. I could see just about an hour, 2 hours ago, I saw a beggar on the street, really cold. Now, I could have seen that man in two ways. I could have seen him just as an irritation. He was in my way while I was trying to get into the shop. Or I could see him as someone created by God, a prince who didn't realize it. So the icon painted properly should show the world transfigured. I love the fact that the word idea comes from the word to see in Greek. And the way we see affects the way we act. So, for example, over COVID, I think COVID is neither a blessing or a curse in itself. It's how we respond to it that's important. I was a novice monk for 12 years, and when I left the monastic life to live in the world, I asked God for rule of life. And the verses in Thessalonians struck me: to give thanks in all circumstances, to rejoice always, to pray without ceasing. But this to give thanks in all circumstances has been really important for me as an iconographer, because by giving thanks, and no matter what circumstances I'm in, whether they appear to be good or bad, I see God written on it. It becomes a source of blessing, particularly the most difficult things. So for me, the great challenge of an iconographer is to depict the world transfigured, to depict not just the face of Father Sophronius, but Father Sophronius as he is in God. I knew Father Paisius. I hadn't painted an icon of it yet, but I would try to depict him as he is in God, not just as a human being. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Aiden. A very, very important contribution. Cornelia, please.
Well, thank you very much, Elena, for organizing this, and a warm greeting from Philadelphia here in the United States. I work in aesthetics. I'm a philosopher by training, and my work attempts to bridge perhaps a gap between theology and art by implanting aesthetics, which is the systematic study of works of art, their being, their behaviors and kinds and so on. Now, I'll try to be as brief as possible to give everyone time to speak. Regarding the subject of COVID, I think this ties in beautifully, as Aiden just said, to the immanence of the icon and the relationship that the icon has to its time and place, but also to tradition. And this is a beautiful topic that I have explored more systematically in a recent book. And I think that what we learn from tradition, and our colleagues who are the iconographers here probably know this much better than I do, or can correct me if I'm wrong. What we know from tradition is its polyvalence and its diversity and its richness and its plasticity and its ability to really adapt to its times, to speak quietly with its times, to sense its times, in some ways that the rest of us cannot, with these sort of sensitive, instruments that the iconographer and artist has. So I would rather leave this question of what happens with COVID to the hands of iconographers who live inside the church and through the grace of the Holy Spirit can sense and see and hear and then paint. And I think really that is the beauty of iconography, and which is really the beauty of art. So that's basically what I have to say for now.
Thank you very much. And I hope we can continue with this important subject of tradition and innovation. But for now, I will give the floor to Elizabeth, please.
So my internet, can you hear me?
Yes.
My internet.
Unfortunately, Elizabeth muted herself, and while we are trying to bring her back, I will give the floor to Sasha, please. We have a problem there as well. This is live. Therefore, the next person that I would like to introduce themselves is Udo. And again, we're having the difficulties in connection. Those were two iconographers and an art historian that were perfectly well working during the preliminary meeting, but unfortunately disappeared. So we'll have to leave it for now. And in fact, following from Cornelia, I will address this this topic of tradition and innovation, not elevating tradition and belittling the innovation, but the modernity brings its challenges. And what Aidan said is how acute is iconography as a process. It's a living iconography. It's a living tradition that is depicted, and we are living it as we live and breathe, so to speak. And that offers to us quite a lot of challenges, and possibly I will ask Aidan to talk about this balance between tradition and innovation in the best possible sense. Please,
Thank you. I think that the challenge today is to distinguish between tradition, capital T, and tradition, small t. In other words, what is timeless in the icon tradition? What are the things you just don't meddle with? And distinguish those from ways that different cultures, different epochs have expressed that tradition. So one can tell probably within 40 years and what part of a country an icon has been painted just from its style alone. So this shows there's plenty of diversity. But I would say probably in the 18th, 19th century that most icons departed from the tradition capital T because perhaps they got too sentimental or concerned with little details, clouded the emphasis on encounter with the saint. So I'm particularly interested in my writing and my study on trying to discern what are those timeless principles. So, for example, I'm asked quite often to do icons of British saints for whom there aren't any icons. So I've got to basically create the first icon. So there I'm trying to find out, well, what's the essence of the saint and try to express that. And if it's a saint who's lived recently and we've got a photograph, I don't want to just to paint a portrait of them as though I was just doing a painted photograph. On the other hand, it's got to look like them. So there you've got this practical decision. How do I abstract this to try to bring out the invisible qualities without distorting their physical likeness? And it's a paradox. You know, how do you combine these things together? It is a likeness, but it's not just an outer likeness, it's an inner likeness.
Thank you. The question to Andreas: how to sustain and understand the living tradition? How is it physically possible to carry the centuries with us and yet to produce something fresh, to inhale and to exhale? How do you actually do it?
Is that a question to me or to an iconographer?
I think I want a theological perspective on it before I address it iconographically.
Theologically, it may be easier to address because the living tradition is basically the experience of living in the church tradition. Mm. So the experience of internalizing, accepting without resistance, and internalize and making into direct experience the tradition that is given to us from the church. And this is not something that I draw out of theory but this is often the answer that is given to me when I ask when I have asked modern iconographers who perhaps seem a little innovative in what they do. I have asked some of them, so what is your gouging? What is your level of, what is your measure? And almost invariably, the answer is the liturgical experience, the experience of participating in the body of the church. So if we can talk about the presence of Jesus Christ in our community in a different way, that is the source of inspiration, theologically. As to how this is translated to an icon, I would like an iconographer to address that.
Before we do that, I want to address the same question to Cornelia and to refine it a little bit and bring the tradition from the small letter rather than tradition from the capital letter, and see where that could be an obstacle to address, if you understood my question, Cornelia.
I I think I did, but let me give it a try and then we'll figure it out. If I may just bring an analogy to what Heraclitus said, that in the same river, many different waters flow. I think tradition is like that. It's like a river within which perhaps many small traditions fall. Things that we see within a particular time frame as perhaps historians of art or historians of iconography. But tradition has an encompassing dimension to it. If you live within it, then innovation is not something incompatible with tradition. Innovation is entailed in tradition. Something that is continuous cannot really be continuous without embodying and the new dimension in it. So it's constantly sort of growing and expanding and enriching itself. Those who try to intrude into that process and cut out little pieces like property, for instance, and elevate that into a doctrine of iconography and so on, or into a favorite style, etc., are violating that entire flow. So I think there's something very profound in tradition if one looks at it from this perspective. Innovation is not, outside tradition. It's very much within the heart of tradition. Those who try to innovate consciously violate this. Those who let themselves live within the church and within, its spiritual life and spiritual reality, find the new in the old. It is this way, in my view, from a historical point of view, in Byzantine iconography or Orthodox iconography, the same way that it is with Sumie painting in Japan, for instance, or China, where that's essentially, what tradition becomes, right? Both continuity and adjustment to its times and incorporation of its times, and at the same time, keeping a certain, identity, which often is elusive. But I think the iconographer, with the grace of God, can see that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Cornelia. Thank you for bringing a new dimension to this discussion. And with a little bit of hope, I would like to bring two of other iconographers' guests. Alexandros, I think you are unmuted. Would you like to introduce yourself and carry on with the flow?
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
My name is Alexandros Alexejevas, and I studied at Princess School. And it was not my first school. Before that, I studied art, sculpture. And I'm an iconographer and work with bronze. My PhD thesis at Princess School was about bronze iconography of Russian old believers. And then I studied in Paris in the Sensor Theological Institute. So I have both artistic and theological experience and background. And my passion is Renaissance art, painting, and especially religious. So I'll try to answer maybe not first, not second, and not third question, but I rather would like to speak about COVID, about this problem, how it can be depicted in iconography. And I was thinking about your question actually, and I think my first reaction was actually to think about images, which images about similar things, and I choose Job, the long suffering. And we have to remember that this image is on analog in the church of the lector in the Passion Week. I think it should be depicted on the Thursday. And it's a very good sample actually of how people are losing everything. And we don't know why. We don't have answers. We just live in universe. And we have to remember the end of conversation in between God and Job, what was told, what the topic was about. Actually, we have to be patient, and we have to enjoy what we have, and we have to accept it as a gift. Everything, every day of our life, we can meet each other, we can paint icons, we can breathe. So for me, the icon of modern time is the Job, the old suffering. Yeah, and if to come back briefly to your previous questions, for me personally, iconography is first of all theology. It's of course it is for as you just noticed, it is for a group of people. It's not for everybody. It's not an art for self-expression. You can express your attitude to certain things, but in frame of tradition. And I agree, this allegory about the river is absolutely right. So it's a tradition has a lot of options for innovations, but these innovations should correspond with the idea of iconography. Actually, it's to express certain attitude to holiness and to express orthodox dogmas, rules, canons, and to express it well without changes. So I think it's the main thing is not to spoil, not to damage, but to support and to develop. About the problem, if you to come back to problems of contemporary iconographers, I'm not speaking about the present, about the people presented here, but I noticed that the quite serious problem is not participating in the church life. Of course, it makes any icon weaker. It makes it superficial, technical, I would say. The time of studying iconography is too short, honestly. It should be much longer. It should be much longer, and it should include actually studies of different schools, maybe different epochs, and symbolism. Of course, symbolism is not something that speaks directly about clothes or gestures. They can be different and they are changing in time, but it can be contemporary done, I would say. But still, we have to look at our roots in this form of art. From the perspective of contemporary artists, actually, iconography is very, very young. And actually, it was revealed just in the beginning of 20th century. It's 100 years old and very fast developing. And normally, people know about iconography very, very little, and is a negative thing, actually. And I would recommend to concentrate not on the physical appearance, but on the spiritual features of saints, because we are speaking about saints mostly. What is the essence of a spiritual deed, for instance? What is what type of spiritual achievements of contemporary saint should be highlighted? And I would pay attention to these things. Yeah. So I don't want to speak longer. Yeah. So maybe.
Thank you very much, Alexandros. I want to follow on what you say and address next question to Aidan here, picking up on what you said and also following on what you said, Aidan. When you make an iconographic image, you have to look at the person as God sees them. that is something that you mentioned, and I would like to present you with this challenging question. If you have to see a person as God sees them, you almost need to identify, to find the divine in yourself, and to reincarnate yourself if you want, or to undergo a certain process. How do you see a person that you know? I don't know whether you met Father Safroni Sakharov, for example, a contemporary saint. If you did meet Father Safroni, then how did you see him as God sees him?
Well, of course, in a sense, having said we got to see the world as God sees it, but I realize, well, that's a terrible thing to say in one sense, because how can one? But I think when I'm painting an icon all the time, consciously or unconsciously, I'm thinking, does it bring sobriety to the viewer? Does it bring quietness? Does it bring humility? Does it open vistas? There's nothing worse than a well-painted icon that's just technically well done, but it's just devoid of a living experience of the church. I think in answer to your question, Elena, to try to show the world as a burning bush as it is in God, you just got to live the life of the church, you know, live the life of prayer, try to follow Christ's commandments. And then we have the sort of music of heaven in our soul. So as an icon painter, if you feel something is discordant with that inner music, then you don't do it. But if it's in accord with that music in your own soul, which is ultimately the Holy Spirit dwelling within one, then you know that it's good. If it's harmonious with that inner music, keep it. If it doesn't, leave it. So I think there's a certain authenticity needed in iconography. And I saw this wonderful exhibition of icons at the Royal Academy, and it had some works from Sinai, 11th, 12th century works. And what struck me about these works was how the icon painter didn't bother too much about getting all the lines straight. You really felt this iconographer knew what it meant when Christ entered into Jerusalem for Palm Sunday, when he was painting Palm Sunday. So he concentrated on important things, but the buildings and a few other secondary details are done really quickly. So there's an authenticity, and you felt that he knew, or she knew, what was being painted. So it can only be done really through living the life of Christ in the life of the church and through in a prayer. And I think just gradually begin to see the world through the eyes of the Holy Spirit rather than just with the brain, isolated from God.
Thank you very much. And I hope Orestes can unmute himself. This is yet another iconographer in our panel of guests. And I'm sorry to leave such a long time without letting you introduce yourself. It was a temporary glitch in technicalities, but the floor is yours, Orestes, please.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Elena. It is a very interesting discussion. Well, in terms of introduction, I may just say that I'm a Byzantinist, artist, iconographer, and theologian. And when I say theologian, obviously I mean in an academic sense, and not as a hierarchy of any kind. We do make this distinction in Greece when we claim to be theologians. It is relevant that my PhD was on the topic of the influence of late Byzantine painting on the abstract painting of the
I'm afraid we're
to
lost.
what Cornelia said, because she really explained very nicely the framework of thinking when it comes to the relationship between tradition and innovation. I may only add that things are not as bad as some of us may think that they are in terms of the world of innovation. We do have, as Cornelia pointed out, attempts at what you would call forceful innovation. But I tend to feel that there are a number of iconographers worldwide who are authentically innovating. So both sides are flourishing, both the forced innovators and the innovators who, for whom I may feel that they are in fact authentic. So there's much to be seen, and I may suggest, I may actually refer you to a text by Professor Yanis Giogas, which is admittedly in Greek, but he wrote on the contemporary Orthodox theologians, iconographers rather, at the dawn of the third millennium, I think the title is. So things are not as bad or not as problematic. Recently, a very significant iconographer, relatively recently, died in Greece. Vasilakis is his surname, and he's probably one of the more important or most important 20th century and now 21st century iconographer. So there's plenty to be seen. I'm only, only briefly explaining that things are also positive rather than simply problematic. So that's one thing to say regarding iconography. Now, regarding the very broad topic that you have presented us with, Elena, I congratulate you on the courage to open the Pandora's box and address everything. I guess in a way, it is good that you have invited iconographers because I'm sure that I'm not alone as an iconographer when I say that iconography, one of the things that iconography tries at its best is to encompass the entirety of the human experience, and within that experience, theology as well. And it is not without consequence that if we open a Russian dictionary, and Elena and Alexandra don't have to do that, though some Russians are not familiar with what I'm going to say. If we open the Russian dictionary, under the word art, which in Russian is искусство, you will find that etymologically, the Russian word for art actually means experience, though experience in Russian is opit. Now, it's very interesting in terms of touching on the topic of COVID, because in my opinion, COVID is an experience, or if you will, the anticipation of the end of one's life, which is part of COVID, has been part of the iconographical contemplation for centuries. So it is nothing new if we take into consideration that iconographers try to encompass the wholeness, the entirety of the iconographical experience. And in a sense, though an icon may depict a single saint or a single event, in itself, its mission, so to speak, in terms of aesthetics, because it is an area of my expertise, aesthetics, its mission is to open a window, as it were, to the wholeness of what there is, despite our limitations and inability to ever grasp everything. The mission of an icon is to help us towards becoming whole. And the Greek word for salvation, which is soteria, really refers to the state of being, as we say in Greek, soos, olokliros, which is to be entire, whole, complete. So to be saved is the state opposite of being fragmented. I may have digressed in terms of the ambitious topic which is presented to us, but this is what happens when you have a very ambitious topic. We are led astray easily, and I hope that's a good thing. And now, as for the email I received about this meeting, there was another question, because I think that Father Andreas has addressed the questions which we were sent very well. I may just mention that there was a question about what are the problems or what are the issues when an iconographer is called to depict a contemporary saint? Okay, so that was one of the questions, and I was anticipating that we will be talking today mostly about that, but that's fine. Well, to those who have not dealt with iconography more systematically, it may be worth mentioning that even in the Byzantine tradition, we do have depictions of either saints or monastery founders that actually, despite the obvious Byzantine style of the painting, that actually retains some of the aspects of physiognomy of the person who is being depicted. So we do have plenty of cases like that. Now, the reason this is relevant, I think, is because it relates partly to the fact that when you depict a contemporary saint, you do have a photograph, a memory, or even a video footage of them. So there's a relationship there, in a sense that in the Byzantine period, it is not foreign as an experience for a painter to actually try to incorporate some of the realistic, not realistic, but real, some of the reminiscent physiognomy of the person whom they're depicting. I wouldn't like to speak more at this point, but those are the two things that I thought of saying in this first round. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Orestes. Talking about Pandora box, I am very much under the entirety of human experience that you've addressed as a iconographic experience, and I think this is something of a huge importance for our conversation here, especially if by entirety of a human experience you also mean a glimpse into the divine experience as well, not as something alien and yet to be contemplated, but actually already included and encapsulated in that entirety of human experience. So I thank you very much for...
I did mean that, if I just may very shortly, I did mean that, quite literally. There's even a study which has been presented, I'm not sure if it has been published, by Father Andrew Lapp, and he speaks of the human experience, giving it a title of the in-between heavens and earth. So yes, I did mean this. This struggle and, you know, this struggle to transcend the bodily, if you will, or to go beyond, it is embedded, it is intrinsic in the human nature. So yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this is something that we can pause on and take into our continuation of thought about iconography in our contemporary realities, or into our thought as iconography as a continuation of our journey in deepening our understanding of our own traditions and in appreciating somebody else's tradition if it's not our own. And on this note, I would like to thank all of our participants and both panelist members and members of the public, so to speak, and apologize that we simply do not have time to ask for your questions and feedback. But what we do have time for is to pause this discussion, but only to pause it, and to keep the inspiration of this wonderful round table experience that we had on Zoom in our unprecedented times. And I would like to invite you to follow us on this journey into the next meeting, which will take place of this particular series, on the 22nd of February at 7 o'clock UK time, and it would be dedicated to religious calendar and religious identity. And I will, thank you, Cornelia, we will be sending you the links to this event, and we have our speaker present amongst us, Dr. Alfred Osborne, and this is something else that we are carrying with us. We are inviting our current participants and guests and panelists to follow us into the following discussions, and the following guests to be present in our current discussions, so that we have a continuation and we can continue looking into the entirety of human experience step by step. Once again, thank you very much to all of you. Keep your questions, post us, and we will keep you contacted, and we will invite you for the following events. Thank you very much indeed, and all the best, and stay safe.